I'm Deep in the Reads, and today I'm going to be reviewing this huge-ass fantasy novel. It's called Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This is Susanna Clarke's debut novel. She spent 10 years working on it and released it in 2004, and it was a runaway bestseller when it came out, but not only that, it was also a critical success. It won the Nebula, Hugo, and World Fantasy Award for Best Novel in 2005. I'm typically not the biggest fan of fantasy novels, but I've been wanting to get into the genre and find a foothold ever since I read Powell Anderson's The Broken Sword and really enjoyed it. And I was a little wary going into this. Obviously it's a very long book and it's a popular fantasy, which I'm generally kind of skeptical about, but I'm pleased to say that this is absolutely the foothold in the genre that I was hoping to find. The story takes place in an alternate history version of England during the early 1800s, with the Napoleonic Wars going on. It's a time when magic used to exist, but it hasn't been seen or practiced in hundreds of years. The world that we see in the book is a very hierarchical, post-Enlightenment society with rigid law and order, and it's all under the authority of the church and the crown. It soon becomes clear that there is one person around who does want to do practical magic, and his name is Mr. Norrell. He's an incredibly arrogant, smug, elitist guy. He comes to England set to bring magic back into the world and take it out of the dusty old tomes and make it real again, but he wants to do it on his terms. He doesn't want to have any other competition, and it's into this world that Jonathan Strange comes along. Once he hears that this guy, Mr. Norrell, is doing magic, he wants in on it, and they eventually get together and decide to partner up to bring magic back into the world. Both characters are sort of arrogant and snooty in their own ways, and I realize that for some reason a lot of people only want to read books where they can envision themselves being best friends with the main characters, but Clarke is very intentional in choosing why she makes the characters the way that they are. In my opinion, she's trying to sort of lampoon elitist academia, and the way in which the characters debate between practical versus theoretical magic is something that's definitely applicable to real-world practices. For example, just take a look at philosophy. It's very similar. There's a lot of other parallels between, say, you could draw parallels to the arts, or philosophy, medicine, and religion, which we'll get into later. But the characters, they're ensconced in their ivory towers, although in this case, in the book, the only tower that shows up is actually ebony, but you get it. Though the characters seem like archetypes at first, the archetypes that you see in the book are only sort of jumping off points. The characters develop very organically as the story goes along, and they all have very definitive arcs. They end up in very different places, and you see the way that the events in the story affect them and change their worldview. The style of the writing in this book is definitely an homage to Georgian and Victorian English novels. The writing is elegant and somewhat flowery with this underlying tone of dry humor. It's also very meticulously researched. The author will throw out occasional references to the etiquette for people in mourning, or the fact that women really couldn't move around in public that much without escorts. Those are the kind of things that kind of make you feel immersed in the time period. And also, as sort of a pastiche of Victorian novels, there's illustrations in this book that are very similar to what you would find in a Dickens or Lewis Carroll novel. The other thing that's very Victorian is the pacing. It's very meticulous and deliberate. It takes 300 pages before the main characters even meet, but despite the fact that I often have problems with fantasy writers being long-winded just for the sake of it, I think that Susanna Clarke does an excellent job at keeping everything contained together, even though there are enough characters in this book to make you feel like you've been slapped in the face with a phone book. It plays out in this sort of episodic way that's sort of round robin. It'll introduce small details which are circled back on later, and slowly those details will intertwine and lead towards the end of the book. It's done in a way that never felt long for me. I usually am very sensitive to the lengths of books, but this one was very accessible the whole way through. But as with any other book that's 1,000 pages long, There are probably scenes that some readers will find unnecessary. However, I think that Clarke is very good at making every scene count for something. Not every scene necessarily advances the plot, but we are introduced to things that seem innocuous at first, but become important later on. For example, we'll see a bit of magic that seems like not particularly important compared to the others, or we'll learn about a character's attitude towards something. We'll sort of forget about it, and then it'll come back later in a major way. And a lot of the magic is just shown, it's not really explained. The processes are not explained in detail, and that allows Clarke to not have to do all these long-winded exposition dumps that so many fantasy novels are notorious for. There are footnotes, of course, but they are optional, so it's really based on your mood. Like, a lot of the time I was really engaged in the story and I didn't want to jump to these huge footnotes, so I would wait until I got to the end of the chapter and then I'd go back and read them. But even those don't necessarily go into the rules around the magic. Like, the magic is always left mysterious and enigmatic, which is exactly what I think an author should want if they want their magic to really feel magical. She doesn't over-explain, she doesn't bore you with being pedantic. It's all delivered in a way that seems natural and comes back later. The payoffs in this book are well worth waiting for. However, I did have a couple of problems with the book. They're very minor, though. One of them is an issue regarding characterization. There's a couple of hiccups. For example, there's this character named Arabella. She's Jonathan Strange's wife, and she's mostly a side character, but later on she becomes pretty important to the plot. And she's just not really fleshed out enough to justify it. Like, I found that a lot of scenes could have been much stronger had we seen this character being well-rounded in the earlier chapters. The other characterization issue I had was, like, so there's a few battle scenes in this book, and one of the characters who goes there has sort of a moral code, and we expect that the war would absolutely challenge their moral code, and they're also very sheltered characters. So we'd expect some of the things that they see in war would, like, shake them to the core, as it does with most people who experience battle. But I find that the characterization opportunities are kind of missed there. It's sort of minimal how this character responds to seeing warfare. The other minor issue I had has to do with the way magic is used in a few places. Like, I definitely prefer soft magic, and I'm fine with rules being sort of enigmatic. However, we see characters confronted with problems that were explicitly solved with magic earlier in the book, and when they're confronted with them a second time, or whatever, like, they don't use magic for some reason. Like, if Clarke said for the plot that she can't have these characters use magic, it would have been fine if she'd just given them some excuse, like, oh, they're being blocked, or whatever. But fortunately, she never uses convenience to get characters out of trouble. They always have to get through problems using their own wit, which is nice. And overall, with these problems that I mentioned, they are relatively minor. Like, in comparison with how really, really strong the book is, mostly the issues are going to fly under most people's radar, I think. And speaking of things flying under other people's radar, let's talk about the deeper themes. I've already talked about the critique of academic elitism in this book, but I think there's more going on to the messaging than just saying, arrogance is bad, kids. Clarke is using various types of tension and various looks into oppression to sort of talk about the world in which Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell are trying to bring magic back to. For example, there's references to colonialism, to classism, to religious tensions, and I think religious tension is the biggest one. Throughout the book, magic is sort of compared and contrasted to Christianity and the influence of the church. A lot of magic is done near something religious or around someone religious, or, the first time we see magic, it's in a church, and there's a very subtle implication that a sorceress was murdered in this church. A little bit later on, there's some magic that's performed that affects a person's left hand, and traditionally, the left hand path represents, like, black magic, where the idea was that people who were left-handed were more open to the influence of devils. And there's other references to this tension between paganism and Christianity in Footnotes, for example. And so it's sort of like this witchcraft Christian sort of thing. And I loved it when The Broken Sword sort of approached these themes, and I love it equally here. It's also pretty smart to set the book at the time period that Clarke does. It's a time that's known both for really rapid social progression in a lot of areas, but also very intense oppression in others. And it's a really good way of highlighting this dynamic between tradition and progress, because those things were really butting heads throughout 1800s in England. There are characters who are from marginalized classes, and you see the way that that marginalization plays out. Like, you'll be going along in the story, and then suddenly you'll get smacked with like this stark reminder of the limitations that these sorts of people had, and the way that they were often robbed of agency. And a lot of the enchantments that you see throughout the book mirror that loss of agency and that marginalization. I love the fact that Clarke actually decides to delve into the social problems of the time period she's setting her book in. Like, most authors who write in fantasy often set their books in a medieval pastiche, but they don't do any deconstruction of the social mores of the time or the hierarchy. They just say, oh, well, it's incidental, I just really want medieval stories, so we're just gonna roll with it. Whereas Clarke will actually confront that. And it's true that there are times where that confrontation and that sort of interplay with class and racial oppression is a little bit clumsy, but for the most part I'm just really interested in that she's doing it at all. And I think that in addition to the book having a really great story, it gives the reader a lot to think about too. In conclusion, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, although it's not perfect, is probably my favorite fantasy novel that I've ever read, so I highly recommend it. I know it looks intimidating, I know it's really long, but trust me, like, once you get going on it, it's super accessible, it's super friendly to read. Like, I just flew through it, and that's coming from somebody who's normally pretty skeptical and hesitant to get into these super, super long fiction novels. And at the end of the day, this book is an 8 out of 10 for me. So yeah, that's the review. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you're nice. Let me know what you think of the book if you've read it, and if you haven't read the book, why? Why haven't you read the book? Read the book. Take this book and read it. Reach through the camera and read it. It's like, I swear, like, this should be better known than it is. Anyway, that's the review. Bye.